Hey, this is Kamori, and today we're going to be making Princess Neptune's dress. We already made her jewelry in a previous video, so now we're going to be making the evening gown that goes with it. And we're going to be using the Simplicity pattern 2442, and we're going to be using view C with a couple adjustments to make it match the character design a little bit more. Cut two of the bodice front pieces out of the teal fabric. I'm using a teal Casa satin from Joann's. Then you're going to sew along the top of the front piece. This is because this area is going to be on the bias, so that's just to keep it from warping while you're working with it. Then we're going to pleat the kind of zigzag area of the bodice so that it looks like this, and sew the pleats in place. Cut two of the bodice front lining pieces out of whatever fabric you plan on using for your lining. I'm just using more of the teal Casa satin. Sew along the side to keep everything in place, just like we did for the bodice front top pieces. And then for this area, instead of pleating it, we are going to sew darts into it. Take the bodice front, top, and lining pieces, put them right sides together, and sew them together along the curved edge here where the bust goes. Press the seam allowance towards the lining and understitch it by just sewing along the edge on the lining side to keep everything in place. Next, I'm going to sew the front and lining pieces of the front of the bodice together along the armhole, along the bottom, and along the side. Following the guidelines on the pattern, I'm going to sew the two bodice front pieces together along the bottom so that the right side is overlapping the left. To make the straps of the dress, we're going to cut 4 of the strap pieces out of the teal satin, and on 2 of the strap pieces we are going to apply some fusible interfacing to the back. Putting right sides together, pin the interfaced strap along the armhole of the bodice. After sewing it in place, press the strap open. Next, we're going to take the other strap piece and put right sides together, and we're going to sew them together, leaving the bottom and the area touching the bodice open and the top open, and sew them together along the shorter side and along the longer side. Then hand sew the inside of the strap into place. To make the back of the bodice, we're going to cut 2 of these pieces out of the outside fabric and 2 of the lining. Now, since I'm using the same thing for both, that means cutting 4 of them. Then put right sides together and we're going to sew them together along the top, leaving a space open that matches with the dots on the pattern, and this is where the straps are going to be inserted into the bodice. Open up the bodice back piece, and putting right sides together, you're going to sew the top, or the outward facing part of the bodice back towards the outward facing part of the bodice front, and sew them together. Fold the rest of the bodice back over and sew it together along the side seam. That way, when you pull back the back of the bodice, the entire seam is going to be encased, so there are no raw edges on either side of the side seam. Pull the shoulder strap through the hole in the bodice back, and then you're going to sew into place. Now, this pattern called for having the straps crisscross in the back, and that's a bit different from Neptune's design. So it does mean that there is going to be quite a bit of excess that we are going to have to trim off of the shoulder straps. After the strap is in place, sew along the edge, along the side and the bottom, just to keep everything together. Cut 2 of the midriff front pieces, and on one side apply some fusible interfacing. Take the front drape piece and you're going to sew 4 lines of a very loose basting stitch so that we can gather it. Gather the drape along the basted areas, sew it down onto the back piece of the midriff along the basted areas and sew it together along the raw edge. Repeat this process to create the side back midriff portions as well. Then sew the midriff pieces together along the side seams to create a front panel for the midriff section of the dress. Putting right sides together, sew the bodice to the top portion of the midriff piece. Next, take the midriff lining pieces and sew them together along the side seams. Now we're going to sew the lining onto the bodice so that it's pretty much a bodice sandwich. There's the lining, the bodice, and then the front midriff piece. Now it's time to move on to the skirt portion of the dress. So we're going to cut out the pattern pieces for the skirt panels. The pattern is for someone considerably taller than me, so I ended up cutting about 5 inches off of the bottom of all of the skirt pieces, and even still it's going to be dragging on the ground behind me. So just something to keep in mind. Now would be a good time to make any adjustments if you need to drastically change the pattern to make it longer or shorter. Princess Neptune's dress has some gathers on either side of the hips that are slightly lighter than the base dress material. Personally, I'm going to be using some lighter teal organza, but you can use whatever material you'd like. You could use an opaque material, or you could use a chiffon for a more gentle drape to the dress. Cut out as many pieces as you'd like of the hip material using the side, front, and back dress panel pieces as the guidelines. Then sew them together along the side. Now, the more panels you cut out, the more gathering there will be, and the fuller the side poofs will be, so it really depends on your personal preference. One thing I should also mention is because of the tendency of organza to fray, for all of the side seams for making the hip panels for Neptune's dress, I used a French seam to encase the raw edge. Then, once your panels have been constructed to the amount of poofiness that you would like, you can hem the bottom. I used a rolled hem, once again, to encase the raw edge, and the remaining raw edge that's going to be attached to the dress, I went ahead and zigzagged along the edge. Next, cut out all of the skirt panels and zigzag around the edges to keep them from fraying. And do a hem along the bottom. I personally used a rolled hem because I like the effect. Sew the side back and side front panels together. Then we're going to attach the organza panels onto their respective side panels. So we're going to sew them together along each of the sides, and then gather the organza so that it can be attached to the top. Attach the rest of the skirt panels all together to create the skirt. Sew the skirt onto the front midriff portion of the bodice. Then we're going to flip it over and hand sew the midriff lining onto the skirt so that the raw edge is completely encased. Now we're going to take the edges of the bodice, since they're still raw, and zigzag along the edges to help keep them from fraying. Next, sew the center back seam together and insert a zipper. To make the design on her shoulder straps, I started by cutting a little template out of some tissue paper, and then cut out the design 3 times out of some leftover gold vinyl. Now I'm cutting 3 of them because 2 are going to be used for the straps of the dress, and then 1 more is going to be saved for later for the back of her choker. Sew the vinyl appliques onto the dress. I added some gold beads around the edges just to give it a little bit more sparkle, and add a large flat circular teal bead in the center. And with that, Neptune's dress is done. For more cosplay sewing tutorials, please subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.